good eyes to read Colossians 2, verses 6 to 15 for us, just to kind of get us in the zone here.
62-year-old has the best eyes here. That's scary. I can read it. I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Todd.
6
Through 15, right here. The end here.
Therefore, as you receive Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. You have been filled in him, who is the head of all rule and authority. In him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you, who were dead in your trespasses, in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities, put them to open shame, triumphing over them.
Thank you so much. I'll open us in prayer, and then we'll dive in. Father of all grace, we thank you for your love and your kindness. I thank you for everyone gathered in here today. Father, we don't want to be taken captive by the vain, idolatrous philosophies of the world. We want to be ruled not by an idea, but by a person, your Son, who you have crowned and made the Lord of all. And so, Father, I pray that this time would be useful to that end, and that we would leave here people more kingdom-minded, more kingdom-focused, because we have been reminded of your Son's kingship, his rightful rule over every sphere. In Christ's name, amen. Well, thank you all again for coming, and let me just real briefly go over what we talked about last week, and then sort of say how this week contrasts, and then sort of gesture towards where we're going in the coming weeks. So last week we talked about what a worldview is. And we said that every story has certain components that would be true, whether it's a fairy tale, as Tolkien said, or the story of the world. And we said those sort of 4 acts were creation, fall, redemption, and then restoration, being set right. And we said everybody has this worldview. It's sort of assumed. And this week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how that informs philosophy, how worldview and philosophy sort of interact with one another. Next Thursday, I'm going to be out of town, and so Mr. McGee suggested we push everything back 1 week. So that will be next week we won't meet, and the following 2 weeks we will. The next time we meet, we'll go over the story of secularism, the worldview of secularism, and how you and I can engage rightfully and thoughtfully in a secular world. And then the last week will be, if we have a Christian worldview, how does that inform our everyday, sort of daily lives? How should we as Christians live with a right worldview? So in terms of this week, I just want to say something about philosophy and worldview. So the illustration Mr. McGee actually gave us was, if this is the world, markers are out here, but basically if the world is in front of us and we stand back from the world, there we are, that's us, this is the world, that there's a lens through which we look at everything, right? And the thing about worldviews is that they're unconscious, they're assumed, right? It's like wearing glasses. You don't think about your glasses, you just sort of look through your glasses. But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes you have to take your glasses off. If the world looks distorted, if you can't see well, you take your glasses off and you clean them, right? You actually take time not to look through your glasses, but to look at your glasses. And what I would propose is that that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is making explicit those things which we often assume and are just sort of implied in our lives, making our presuppositions actual suppositions, actual sort of identified, concrete, systematized beliefs. And, people go back and forth on emphasizing worldview or philosophy, one more than the other. And I think there's a feedback loop. And that, a healthy one of the one will lead to a healthy one of the other. I mean, you raise a child, and you're not trying to give them a philosophy before you give them a worldview, right? They just, they grow up, and you pray with them, right? It's our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. What you don't try to do is say, all right, so I'm going to prove to you through like Aristotelian logic that there is a God of the universe, right? The kid wouldn't care at all. He would just say, he would just look at you, a 4-year-old. But a 4-year-old could say, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, right? A 4-year-old can understand that, like, you are a daddy, God is father, God is dad. So you're raised sort of just a worldview, a general disposition towards life. But then, as all of you know, because we try to encourage this at Legacy, where there is a safe place in which to do this so that it doesn't happen later with more hostile actors involved, is there will come a time in a kid's life where they have this worldview, this disposition towards life, and they're looking through these glasses, and something will look smudged to them. Something will just look slightly off kilter. And they'll say, why can't I express myself physically with someone I really like? Or why is it the case that we're trying to convince all these people who are just trying to hold these beliefs that they're wrong? Why should we do that? And the world starts to look a little smudged to them, and they'll take off the worldview that we have passed down, imperfectly, yes, but faithfully. They'll take it off, and they'll actually look at it. And this will be a time where they're engaging in real philosophy. And they're saying, is what I have assumed, right? That's the implicit part. Is what I've assumed about the world, in fact, true? And this is the process of philosophy. So real briefly, a very thumbnail sketch. We're going to talk about, we're going to contrast two different philosophic traditions. And so before we get to Christian philosophy, I want to contrast Plato and Aristotle. And I think that'll be helpful, especially as we get to him when we just read Paul and Colossians. And he, I think, is referencing some Platonic themes. And then we're going to contrast Augustine and Aquinas, just to see sort of how we could take off our glasses and how worldviews relate to philosophy. So worldview unconscious, philosophy conscious. But of course, these things go back and forth, right? You take your glasses off to clean them, not for the effort to keep looking at them, but for the effort of putting your glasses back on and just intuitively responding to the world again. So this is a famous Degas painting that is in, I think, the Met in New York. And here, I can make it bigger. What's something you notice about the painting? It can be a color or anything. What's something you notice about the painting? Yeah, that's great. Yeah, one's looking out. One's looking like towards your foot or the wall. What else? So they're at a ballet studio, and maybe you saw the next slide. I sort of focused in on it. What objects are present? Maybe that'll be a helpful way to go about it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a watering can. That's what I kind of focused on in the next slide. There's a watering can, and apparently this is really important to Degas because you can't really see it well because of the lighting. But he signs just coming out of the water can. So it's almost like his name is coming out of the water can. So I'll just ask, what do you think that means? Why does he put a watering can in the painting? Why might a watering can be present in this picture? I would say there's no wrong answers, but there probably is. So let's ask this way. why do you think, if you're dancing on a wood floor like this and so forth, why might one need a watering can in a situation like this? Yeah. 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 Good. My sister-in-law is a professional ballerina, and I saw this painting almost by happenstance, and I asked her, and she said that maybe it is for traction. You know, if it's wet, you can get more traction with your slippers or whatever. And I did not know and didn't have a good answer, but I looked into the painting, and Degas, it turns out, I learned, paints in shapes. And so in all of his paintings, there was called like visual echoes throughout. And a visual echo is where you see one thing and then it gets replayed again. It gets placed anew. And once these two images, shapes, are put next to each other, what you see is that the one girl at the bar is in a similar shape. Her elbow sort of looks like the handle. Her leg sort of looks like the spout. It's a visual echo. And I was struck by this mostly because this is apparently, again, I'm not an art history person, but this is apparently a very well-known and used technique or device, namely using shapes to make points. And yet when I approached this painting, I looked at the can and I thought, what's its function, you know? What is it there for? What can it do? And Degas is saying, no, I'm not drawing this in order to say what could it do. Turns out the can has no point there. We can sort of make points up, you know, but it turns out its only reason for being there is to be a visual echo to attune yourself better to the young girl. And so this is helpful. I always show this at the beginning of the year because, not that I will have y'all a whole year, because it sort of shows you that as you go into a painting, there's certain like questions you have, like of functionality, that perhaps others would not have. So real quickly, I want to watch this little clip of the great Tom Brady. And as we do so, again, I'm going to contrast Plato and Aristotle, and then Augustine and Aquinas. But just to say something about sort of pre-Platonic philosophy, because we sort of say philosophy starts with Plato writing. To say something about pre-Platonic philosophy, the thing pre-Platonic philosophy is sort of groping at in various ways. People like Thales, Pythagoras, is what is the essence of life? Like, what is life about? And the reason I think it's helpful to look at some pre-Christian philosophers is to say this question is not unique with the New Testament. It's not unique even with the Old Testament. It's not unique when we ask it. When we take our glasses off and sort of look at the frame. But it's something deeply intuitive. It is what it is. It is what it is to be human, to ask these fundamental questions. So real quick, here's Tom Brady doing philosophy, asking the question, what is the point of life?
Can you go out to a restaurant? If I have the energy to deal with, put half my face on. Sometimes I don't feel like that.
Now, you seem a bit the reluctant start.
Well, the problem is it's You're right. You're right. It has. And I didn't think it came with all the other baggage, though.
The most eligible bachelor in America.
Well, it's very flattering. But at the same time, I don't think I sleep any better at night. Being that. No way.
You mean like alone or not alone? I what did you mean by that?
Yeah, that's right.
But with all that money, fame, and career accomplishments, we were surprised to hear this from him.
Why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there for me? I mean, maybe I'm this is what it is. I reached my goal, my dream, my life is, man, thank God. It's got to be more than this.
What's the answer?
Wish I knew. Wish I knew. I love playing football and I love being a quarterback for this team. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of parts about me that I'm trying to find.
Can you go out to restaurants?
So, here, let's restart this. So Tom Brady gets to, this is kind of what we were talking about last week as well in terms of the redemption bit of the story. Tom Brady gets that thing which he thinks he was made for, that whatever the fall narrative would be, right? Laziness, lack of muscle, lack of skill, fine motor skill, etc. He overcomes that fall, that problem. He achieves the thing which he thinks will give him new creation, right? The thing that he will give him restoration. And in fact, what he says is what? There has to be more to life than this. That's the question of philosophy. It's the most intuitive thing that you can imagine. It is the question of why. That's philosophy. So really briefly, that expresses itself pre-Plato in three big questions. Is reality one or many? Is it united? Is it a one thing? Or is it sort of atomic? Is it just many things, like is reality made of something like water or fire, or is it like atoms, right? An atomic theory of reality. Is it visible or invisible? This becomes quite important. The delineation and distinction between physics and metaphysics, between incorporeal and corporeal. So someone like, Thales has a very corporal view that all reality comes from one physical, corporal source. And what we'll find in Plato is that Plato says, no, reality doesn't come from something physical. There may be physical components of life that we can't survive without, like water, like fire. But that there has to be something incorporeal which binds and upholds all reality. And just real quickly, you'll recognize this image, no doubt. And as we think of how Christianity will not borrow from the other philosophies, but will fulfill the longings of the question, just like it will, just like the gospel will ultimately, we believe, I certainly believe, give resolution to Tom Brady's angst. It also gives resolution to these gropings of pre-Platonic philosophy of, is reality one or many, right? The Trinity will resolve that, we'll see. Is it corporal or incorporeal? This is the Notre Dame Cathedral. And like all of the great cathedrals of the world, it is built for people who spend their lives working in fields, looking down at the ground, looking at dirt, right? Making a living to feed their family, which is physical, so that they can go on living physically, right? Looking at the ground all week, and then on Sunday, you walk into a cathedral, and where does your eye go? It goes upward, right? You look, you're drawn out of yourself. You're drawn out of, in other words, there is more than your farm. There is more than your bakery. There is more than your shop. On Sunday, the people's eyes were drawn upward to a metaphysic, not a physicality. So it's natural that we would concern ourselves with physical things. But a cathedral is a place where this resolution of corporal or incorporeal gets resolved, because life is, yes, you have physical realities, and even, look, it burned down, right? I mean, this is a physical structure, ultimately. But it points to this deep reality of the faith and of philosophy that prime reality has to be a metaphysic. It has to be something incorporeal. And then
You have that picture in your presentation before this week?
No. I just added that.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but it is amazing, right? Looking at that. So let me say something about Socrates real quickly. which is, so it seems like, I'm introducing this other player, but this is all just to get to Plato, right? Because Plato, as we will see, is the great rememberer of Socrates. And Socrates can't be understood except that in the Peloponnesian War, Athens is sacked, desolate. Athens is known as this place of great ideas and ideals and philosophy. And Socrates comes on the scene bringing a philosophy, right? Educating the children. And it is very upsetting to people for this reason. Athens is seen as this very intellectual, heady place, and yet all of that philosophy, all of that intellect could not save them in the end. And so right at a time when Athens is wanting to look beyond just philosophy, what are they wanting to get to? They're wanting to get to back to an economic stability. They're wanting to get back to a physical security. And in such a context, Socrates, as you can imagine, does not find a very welcoming home. Instead, he finds people who are cynical that philosophy has anything good to offer. They're skeptical, and they're extremely pragmatic. This is my favorite cartoon to illustrate skepticism. He says, "I don't believe we've met." Another guy says, "I don't believe you don't believe we've met," which is beautiful and very much captures the Athenians. What good does all of your thinking do me? It will not put food on the table, right? Which you can imagine, maybe even rightly in some ways, saying to a student, right, major in philosophy, but how will that get you a job, right? I mean, this is like a sentiment that is something deeply in us because thinking is intangible. Philosophy is an intangible. And so Athens turns to sophism, just real briefly. Sophism is sort of the art of persuasion, and whereas we might think of law being based on something still and outside of ourselves, external to ourselves, sophists were able to convince people of anything. They were sort of just lawyers for hire who really had no ethics and weren't appealing to what is the absolute right, transcendent, good thing to do in any situation. Rather, they were just saying, tell me your situation, and I can argue on your behalf to put food on the table. So justice stopped being sort of the focus of law, and instead defense became the focus of law. And as you can imagine, this is the exact same time we get sort of a democrat jury system of law, where persuasion becomes very important. And it isn't sort of one person thinking about a transcendent metaphysic, but it is a group of people saying, all right, and not, of course, not that this is bad, but all of these things are coinciding with one another. And Socrates obviously hated this. And what Socrates wanted to do was wake people from their intellectual slumber and say, let's take our glasses off and say, are there smudges here? How can we think more rationally? Is there a place for external truth? This obviously frightens the authorities for the following reason, namely, if people are all thinking for themselves, if they're all sort of have this higher truth to appeal to, that really disrupts the sort of demagogic authority structure that would really lend itself well to protecting Athens, to making Athens an influential city. This is the great painting of the death of Socrates, and this gets us to Plato, really. It's a little dark, so you may not be able to tell, but there are 12 people in the painting, or excuse me, 13 people. There are 12 people aside from Socrates in the painting. It's supposed to be a sort of Last Supper. This obviously is Socrates, and anyone want to take a stab at what he's drinking here? He's drinking hemlock. So the story of Socrates is that finally the Athenians said, all right, Socrates, you have to stop philosophizing, asking the kids questions. They called him a gadfly. You're just stirring up trouble. You're getting people to think to themselves, you need to stop doing this. And they say you have two options. You can either stop with your philosophizing, stop asking questions, stop asking why, and sort of toe the line towards making Athens an economic power again, or you can drink the hemlock. And this really classic painting of the death of Socrates portrays Socrates as a sort, that's supposed to be sort of a Last Supper, right? Where everyone else, there's many things we could notice about it. Everyone is sort of curled over, bent. They're in agony and passion, whereas Socrates sits erect, pointing upward, right, to that great transcendent metaphysical principle, and he's drinking of the cup that they think is the cup of death, but he says the unexamined life is not worth living, and for him it's the cup of life. He's choosing life over death. And so there's supposed to be all sorts of parallels in this particular painting with Jesus, as you might imagine. You could go through, each person is someone. Interestingly, and this brings us to really the meat of what we're going to talk about, who do you think this old man is here? Any guess? This old man, and what you'll notice once I tell you who he is that this whole scene is kind of coming out of the back of his head. That's Plato. We know about Socrates, not because Socrates wrote anything, but because Plato recounts the conversations that he had with Socrates. And interestingly, Plato was in his late 20s whenever Socrates dies, and he's obviously painted here as an old man. And so it's a memory of Plato, this whole Socratic episode. And what Plato will instill in Western philosophy, which we'll criticize in a second, but what we'll commend, is that he says, in fact, there has to be more to life than physicality, and Socrates helps us by gesturing upward, by asking these questions to attune ourselves to prime reality, rather than just going through life with pragmatic ends, just worried about putting food on the table and such. He founds the Academy, the groves of Academe, right? Legacy Christian Academy, all of these have Platonic roots. And he puts above the door of the Academy, let none but geometers enter here. This is somewhat an allusion to, the Pythagoreans, right? The mathematicians. I mean, math is incorporeal. It's like logic. In one sense, Plato is saying, what I'm concerned about the Academy, it's not just mathematics, but is there an incorporeal metaphysical component of life which will bind everything together? But to get more to the contrast between what Plato and Aristotle, before we get to Augustine and Aquinas, is that geometry is the science of measurement, the forms of measurements. They could be triangular, rectangular, etc. But Plato said the universe isn't just measured in forms, but it is forms. Now, what does this mean? Well, this means that this table, how do we know this is a table? Well, we recognize it's a table. We remember it's a table. All the re words in any translation of Plato, you'll get all the re's. So in other words, this table, it's not just that I saw 1,000 different tables and then I come to this and I'm like, yeah, this kind of looks like a table. Instead, there is a perfect table, like a geometric table. And it exists not in this corporal world of touching, seeing, smelling, tasting. Rather, it exists in the incorporeal world where there is no seeing or touching or smelling. It's the perfect table. And from that table emanates all tables on the physical world. And you and I, says Plato, have existed in that world, that incorporeal world of forms, such that you remember, you come across this table and you say, I remember this. One way to approach Plato, to think of who was Plato, would be, there's this story he tells of Socrates. He's on a road and he comes across an illiterate slave boy, he says. No education, doesn't know anything. And Socrates, just through, like, some talk about Socratic dialogue, just asking questions, just by asking questions. He doesn't teach the boy anything. He just asks him questions. Just by asking questions, Socrates is able to lead the young man to articulate the Pythagorean theorem. And Plato says, why is that the case? Like it's a deep epistemological question of how is that boy who didn't know anything able to just express it himself? Well, the reason is, says Plato, is it must be, he says, we all just recall things, that all knowledge we have is sort of a priori things that you and I as disembodied souls up in the formal world bumped into and saw and encountered here on earth. So just real quickly, we won't even read this, but the cave illustration is sort of the classic example, right? And you'll probably remember the cave illustration, which is that there's some people, they're chained up and they're staring at a cave wall. And behind them is some fire, and behind that is an exit to the cave. And people walk around outside in the real world, and these people have never looked behind them. They've only looked in front of them. And because there's a fire behind them and people walking behind that, there's shadows. And Plato says that the people, the cave people who are staring at the wall, that is real life to them, right? This world of shadows, that's all there is. And they make games of they bet on people in various ways, like walking past, like what shadow will go faster, whatever. And they're just consumed with these shadows because that's all they know. But Plato says, what if one person was able to break free from the chains and turn around? He says, how hard would that be? It would be really hard because they've never stood up before. They've just been chained staring at a wall their entire life. What if they could? And they walk out. He says, what would happen? Oh, they would bump into reality, right? They would see, oh, they're butterflies. They would see their people. And he says, think about the difference between a person and their shadow. They're similar, right? It's you in a sense, but it's also totally not you. And then Plato says, so this guy walks around, he sees the sun, he sees people, he sees grass, he sees butterflies, he sees these things, trees, that he's seen before, but that he also has never seen before. And he says, what would happen if that guy came back into the cave and he goes, guys, listen. And then he tries to explain to them real life. He says, what would the other cave people do? And being familiar with, right, the explosion out of the back of Plato's head, the memory of Socrates, they would kill the guy because they would say, what use is that to me? They would kill the guy. So Plato says, this is how it is. You and I, we bump in, we eat, we have clothes, we do all this stuff, but ultimately none of that sort of is real, right? Now, briefly, Aristotle studies under, this is my favorite illustration ever if you watch The Office, Aristotle is very much the Dwight Schrute of the Academy because he loves Plato. I always call him the assistant to the regional director of the Academy. But he gets passed over just sort of constantly to replace Plato at the Academy. So he starts